gathering in the past 5 years, with a phone call from my mother explaining why I needed to dress appropriately and try not to embarrass the family. I was standing in my hotel room at the Fairmont, looking at the mustard yellow bridesmaid dress Patricia had specifically chosen for me, when Mom called with her final instructions. "Emma, sweetheart, I know this is hard for you," she said in that tone she'd perfected, part sympathy, part condescension. "Being around all of Marcus's successful friends, seeing Patricia's family with their achievements. Just remember that not everyone can be a doctor or lawyer." "I'll keep that in mind," I replied, zipping up the dress that made me look like a diseased banana. "And please don't mention your job situation unless someone asks directly. It's Marcus's day and we don't want people feeling uncomfortable." My job situation. That's what the family called it now. Not my career, not my work, my situation. Like it was a medical condition that required delicate handling. The truth was, I'd built Anderson Global Logistics into a $4.2 billion supply chain management company that employed over 85,000 people across 47 countries. We handled distribution for 30% of the Fortune 500, had revolutionized cold chain logistics for pharmaceutical companies, and were 3 days away from closing the largest merger in our industry's history. But to my family, I worked at a grocery store. It had started innocuously enough. 7 years ago, when I was building my first distribution center, I'd worked nights at a Safeway to understand every aspect of food retail from the ground up. I wanted to know how products moved from suppliers to shelves, how inventory management worked at the store level, how customer demand patterns shifted. Most executives learn this stuff from spreadsheets and consultants. I learned it by scanning barcodes and stocking shelves from midnight to 6 a.m. When family asked about work during those early years, I'd say I was in food retail or working in supply chain logistics. Somehow this got translated into Emma works at a grocery store. And once that narrative took hold, it was impossible to correct without seeming like I was lying or delusional. The first time I tried to explain what Anderson Global actually did, Uncle Richard had patted my shoulder and said, "That's great, honey. It's good that you're ambitious about your grocery store job." When I mentioned hiring my first 100 employees, Aunt Susan had nodded supportively and said, "Oh, are you managing a department now? That's wonderful progress." Eventually, I stopped trying to correct them. It was easier to let them think what they wanted than to deal with their skepticism. And honestly, part of me was curious to see how long they could maintain their delusions about my life. The answer apparently was indefinitely. The rehearsal dinner the night before had been particularly brutal. Patricia's family were genuine achievers. Her father had built a successful construction company. Her brother had just sold his tech startup for $50 million. Her mother was a federal judge. They were warm, accomplished people who clearly expected Marcus's family to be equally impressive. "So Emma," Patricia's brother Jason had asked during cocktails, "Marcus mentioned you work in food service. Are you planning to open your own restaurant?" Before I could answer, Marcus jumped in. "Oh no, Emma's not the entrepreneur type. She works at a grocery store. It's honest work, though." The slight pause in conversation was painful. Jason recovered quickly. He was too polite to show his surprise, but I saw Patricia's parents exchange a glance. They were clearly wondering how a family that included doctors, lawyers, and successful business owners had produced someone whose biggest achievement was apparently avoiding unemployment. "Food retail is fascinating," I'd said simply. "The logistics alone are incredibly complex." "I'm sure," Patricia's father had replied kindly, then immediately changed the subject to Marcus's law practice. Later that evening, I'd overheard Patricia's mother talking to my mother by the hotel bar. "Patricia mentioned Emma might be a godmother to their children someday," she'd said carefully. "Oh, Emma would love that," Mom had replied. "She's wonderful with kids. Of course, she's not in a position to be much of a financial influence, but she's very loving." Financial influence? Well, she's still finding her way professionally. We help her out when we can. Family takes care of family. But your grandchildren will have plenty of successful role models without needing to worry about Emma's situation. I'd left the bar after that and spent the rest of the evening in my room, reviewing acquisition reports and trying to remember why I'd thought attending this wedding was a good idea. The morning of the ceremony brought fresh humiliations. During hair and makeup, the other bridesmaids, Patricia's sister and 2 college friends, were discussing their careers. One was a pediatric surgeon, another was launching her second startup. The third was a partner at a consulting firm. And Emma works in grocery, Patricia had explained when they asked about me. She's been doing that for years now. Oh, the surgeon had said politely. That must be stable work. Very stable, I'd agreed, not mentioning that Anderson Global's stability came from having exclusive contracts with every major food retailer in North America. The conversation had moved on to their vacation plans. Someone's family had a house in the Hamptons, another was planning a month in Europe. When they'd asked about my travel plans, I'd simply said I didn't have any scheduled, rather than explain that I'd be in Singapore next week finalizing a $1.8 billion merger, followed by board meetings in London and a factory opening in Bavaria. The wedding ceremony itself was beautiful. Patricia looked radiant in her grandmother's lace dress, and Marcus seemed genuinely happy. I stood at the altar holding the bridal bouquet, trying to focus on their joy appearance. Poor Emma, I'd heard Aunt Susan tell someone behind me. That color is so unflattering on her. Patricia should have chosen something more appropriate for her complexion. The dress isn't the problem, someone else had whispered back. It's the stress. Financial pressure ages you. I'd maintained my smile throughout the ceremony, even when the photographer had positioned me slightly behind the other bridesmaids for the formal photos. For composition, he'd explained, though everyone understood it was to minimize the visual impact of the family member who didn't quite fit. The reception was held in the Fairmont's Grand Ballroom, a beautiful space that I'd actually considered purchasing 2 years ago before deciding the location wasn't right for my real estate portfolio. The dinner was excellent, though I barely tasted it as I endured toast after toast that somehow managed to celebrate everyone's achievements except mine. To Patricia's family, Marcus had said, raising his champagne glass. Judge Whitfield, who's dedicated her life to justice. To Jason, who just sold his company for more money than most of us will see in a lifetime. To Mr. Whitfield, who built his construction empire from nothing. He turned to our side of the room. To my family. Uncle Richard, who just made partner at his accounting firm after 20 years of dedication. To Cousin Derek, who opened his second dental practice this year. To Dr. Patricia's maid of honor Sarah, who's saving lives as a pediatric surgeon. His eyes had found mine during the pause. And to family members who support us in their own special ways. My sister Emma, who flew all the way from Seattle to be here despite the expense. She works in food service, which is honest, necessary work, and we love her for her dedication to simpler values. The applause had been polite but pointed. Several people had looked at me with the kind of gentle sympathy usually reserved for recovering addicts or the recently divorced. It was during the dancing portion that the real drama began. I'd stepped onto the terrace for some air when I overheard a conversation that would change everything. Patricia's mother was speaking with Marcus near the bar, her voice sharp with concern. Marcus, I need to ask you something directly, she'd said. Is Emma financially stable? I don't mean to pry, but Patricia mentioned she might want Emma to be godmother to your children, and given her circumstances. Emma? God, no, she's been struggling for years, Marcus had laughed. She's sweet, but she can barely take care of herself. She's been working the same grocery store job for 7 years now? Never got promoted, never tried anything else. I think she's just not built for ambition, you know? Mrs. Whitfield had looked relieved. I was concerned about the influence. Not that there's anything wrong with her work, of course, but Patricia comes from a family of achievers. Her father built his company from nothing, her brother just made $50 million on his startup. We want our grandchildren to have the right kind of role models. Don't worry about that, Marcus had said. Emma's basically the family charity case at this point. Mom sends her money for rent sometimes, we all chip in for her car payments. She means well, but she's just not capable of more than she's doing now. That wasn't true. I'd never asked for or received financial help from anyone in my family. But apparently, that was the story they told themselves to make sense of my deliberately modest lifestyle choices. I'd been about to head back inside when I heard Derek's voice from around the corner, talking to some of Patricia's relatives. Did you see Emma's car in the parking lot? He was saying. It's like 15 years old. I actually felt embarrassed for her when the valet had to figure out how to start it. Marcus mentioned she's been using food stamps. Another voice had replied, one of Patricia's cousins, I thought. It's just sad, Derek had continued. The whole family is successful except her. My mom thinks she might have some kind of learning disability that was never diagnosed. How else do you explain someone working the same entry-level job for 7 years? At least she seems happy, the cousin had said charitably. I guess ignorance is bliss, Derek had replied. She has no idea how far behind she's fallen. I'd heard enough. I'd pulled out my phone and sent a text to David, my head of security, ready for pickup. His response had come immediately, 10 minutes. Helicopter fueled and ready. I'd made my way back to the ballroom, planning to say quiet goodbyes and slip away before the evening got worse. But as I'd reached the main table, Marcus had tapped his champagne glass for attention. Ladies and gentlemen, he'd begun, I want to take a moment to thank everyone for being here tonight. Patricia and I are so grateful to be surrounded by such successful, accomplished people. Our families represent the absolute best of what hard work and ambition can achieve. He gestured around the room. We have entrepreneurs who've built million-dollar companies, doctors saving lives, lawyers fighting for justice, executives running major corporations. People who've taken risks, pushed boundaries, refused to settle for less than excellence. His eyes had found mine across the room, and there'd been something almost pitying in his expression. But we're also grateful for family members who contribute in simpler ways. My sister Emma flew all the way from Seattle to be here tonight, even though I know the cost was probably difficult for her budget. She works in food service, which is honest, humble work. Not everyone can be a CEO or a surgeon, and that's perfectly okay. The applause had been polite but condescending. Several people had looked at me with the kind of sympathy usually reserved for someone announcing a terminal diagnosis. Emma represents something important, Marcus had continued, warming to his theme. In a world obsessed with achievement and status, she reminds us that there's dignity in simple work, value in modest goals. She's content with her life, and that's actually quite admirable. Patricia's father had stood up, clearly feeling generous after several glasses of wine. To Emma, he'd called out, for showing us that happiness doesn't require success. The room had raised their glasses to me like I was some kind of inspirational poster about overcoming limitations. I could see pity in their eyes, mixed with relief that their own children had turned out so much better. That's when my phone had buzzed. Ms. Anderson? The voice belonged to a tall man in an impeccable black suit who had somehow appeared beside me without anyone noticing. David Martinez looked exactly like what he was, former Secret Service, trained to handle threats to world leaders, now dedicated to protecting one of Seattle's most valuable executives. I'm David Martinez, your head of security, he'd continued, his voice carrying just far enough for nearby tables to hear. I apologize for the interruption, but we have an urgent situation that requires your immediate attention. The conversations around us had stopped. David had the kind of presence that commanded rooms, 6 feet 2 inches of professional alertness and expensive suits. Security. Mrs. Whitfield had repeated, looking confused. The helicopter is waiting on the roof, David had continued smoothly. Your 9 p.m. conference call with the Singapore team cannot be delayed. The Chin Industries merger closes Monday morning, and the Tokyo markets open in 3 hours. The board is waiting for your final approval on the $1.8 billion acquisition. Marcus's champagne glass had slipped from his hand, shattering on the marble floor. I'm sorry to cut this short, I'd said, standing and smoothing down the terrible mustard dress. I tried to keep business separate from family time, but unfortunately, international markets don't respect wedding schedules. Emma, what the hell is going on? Marcus had grabbed my arm, his voice cracking slightly. David had stepped closer, not threateningly, but with the kind of professional readiness that made it clear he was prepared for any situation. Sir, I'll need you to step back from Ms. Anderson. Ms. Anderson? Patricia's voice had been barely a whisper. I'd looked around the room at all the faces staring at me, the same people who'd spent the entire evening discussing my failures and limitations like I wasn't even there. I suppose I should explain, I'd said. My name is Emma Anderson, and I'm the founder and CEO of Anderson Global Logistics. We're the largest privately held supply chain management company in North America, with operations in 47 countries and annual revenue of $4.2 billion. The silence had been absolute. The grocery store job Marcus mentioned? That's how I started. I worked nights at Safeway for 3 years while building my first distribution center during the day. I wanted to understand every aspect of food retail, customer behavior, inventory management, supply chain logistics, employee dynamics. Most executives learn this from consultants and spreadsheets. I learned it by scanning barcodes and stocking shelves. Derek's face had gone completely white. We handle distribution for about 30% of the Fortune 500, I'd continued. Walmart, Target, Kroger, Safeway. If you've bought groceries in the past 5 years, there's a good chance our systems got that food from farm to shelf. We revolutionized cold chain logistics for pharmaceutical companies, developed the algorithms that optimize delivery routes for Amazon's grocery division, and created the inventory management systems used by most major retailers. Mrs. Whitfield had been staring at me like I'd just announced I was from another planet. You're the CEO? Forbes ranked me 47th on their list of richest self-made women, I'd said. Though I prefer to focus on the fact that Anderson Global employs over 85,000 people worldwide and has been carbon neutral for 3 years running. Patricia had found her voice first. Marcus, you said she worked at a grocery store. She does. Marcus had looked like he was having trouble processing basic information. She told me she worked in food retail. Food retail logistics, I'd clarified gently. I oversee supply chain operations for every major grocery chain in North America, plus expanding operations in Europe and Asia. When I said I worked in food retail, I meant I was revolutionizing how food gets from producers to consumers. Uncle Richard had been staring at his bourbon like it might provide answers. The resume help I offered was very thoughtful, I'd said. Though my current position is working out well. David had checked his watch. Ms. Anderson, we really do need to leave. The Singapore call is critical, Chin Industries won't wait, and if we miss this window the merger could collapse. That's 18,000 jobs hanging in the balance. Of course. I turned to Marcus and Patricia. Congratulations again on your wedding. It was beautiful and I wish you both every happiness. Wait, Marcus had grabbed my arm again, then immediately let go when David had shifted his weight. Emma, I don't understand. Why didn't you tell us? Why let us think? Tell you what? That I was successful? Would it have mattered? Of course it would have mattered. Really? Because based on what I overheard tonight, you all seemed pretty comfortable with your version of who I was. The family charity case. The one who needed financial help. The learning disabled sister who was too limited for real achievement. We never said you were learning disabled, Derek had protested weakly. You literally said that 20 minutes ago on the terrace, I'd replied. Along with speculating about my food stamp usage and expressing embarrassment about my car. Patricia's father had still been staring at me in shock. You actually run $1 billion company? She's on the Forbes list, someone had whispered from the back of the room. I turned to see one of the younger cousins holding up her phone. Emma Anderson, CEO of Anderson Global Logistics. Net worth estimated at $2.3 billion. The murmur that had gone through the room was like watching dominoes fall. This doesn't make sense, Aunt Susan had said, her voice almost accusatory. If you're so wealthy, why do you dress so modestly? Why do you drive an old car? Why live like a normal person? Because money isn't the most important thing in life, I'd said. I thought family was. I thought showing up for people you love mattered more than showing off your net worth. I thought being humble about success was a virtue. Marcus had been shaking his head. But you let us think you were struggling. I didn't let you think anything, Marcus. You assumed. You all did. You decided that because I didn't brag about my accomplishments at every family gathering, I must not have any. You created an entire narrative about my life, complete with financial problems I don't have and limitations I've never shown, without ever asking me a single direct question about what I actually do for work. But you said you worked in food retail, Patricia had protested. I said I worked in food retail logistics. When I mentioned supply chain management, you nodded politely and changed the subject. When I talked about hiring employees, you assumed I meant I was managing a grocery store department. When I said I traveled for business, you figured I meant training sessions at other locations. The room had been completely silent now, everyone processing the magnitude of their assumptions. You know what's funny? I'd continued. 3 years ago when I missed Christmas, you all decided it was because I couldn't afford the plane ticket. The truth is, I was in Tokyo, personally negotiating a contract that brought 2,000 manufacturing jobs back to the United States. Last year, when I couldn't make Derek's wedding, you assumed I was working extra shifts to make rent. Actually, I was in Germany opening our newest facility that now employs 1,500 people. Derek had looked like he might be sick. Miss Anderson, David had interrupted gently. The helicopter. I'd nodded. I really do have to go. Singapore doesn't wait, and there are a lot of people depending on this deal closing successfully. As I'd moved toward the exit, the room had parted around me like I was visiting royalty. The same people who'd been pitying me 5 minutes ago were now staring with a mixture of awe, confusion, and what I was pretty sure was embarrassment. At the door I turned back one last time. For what it's worth, Marcus, I hope you and Patricia are very happy together. Marriage should be about loving someone as they are, not as you assume they should be. Maybe that's something worth remembering. The elevator ride to the roof had been silent except for the soft jazz playing through the speakers. David had held the door for me as we stepped onto the hotel's helipad, where my pilot was waiting with the rotors already spinning. How was the wedding, ma'am? David had asked as he'd helped me into the helicopter, having to raise his voice over the noise. Educational, I'd replied, buckling my seatbelt and putting on the headset. As we'd lifted off, I could see people gathered on the hotel's lower terraces, looking up at the helicopter with obvious confusion. My phone was already buzzing with calls and texts. Marcus, Derek, Aunt Susan, numbers I didn't recognize. I turned off the phone and looked out at the city lights below. Tomorrow I'd be back to managing supply chains and board meetings and the thousand small decisions that kept a global company running smoothly. Tonight had been a reminder of why I kept those worlds separate. But maybe it was time to stop hiding who I'd become. Maybe the people who truly mattered would love me anyway, and the ones who didn't, well, perhaps their approval wasn't worth having after all. Singapore, ma'am? The pilot had asked through the headset. Actually, I'd said, let's make a quick stop at the office first. I want to change out of this dress. It's terrible, and I have a feeling the Singapore meeting is going to be photographed. David had smiled. Yes, ma'am. I did mention that mustard yellow wasn't your color. As Seattle's skyline had grown larger ahead of us, I'd found myself actually smiling. Tomorrow's business news would probably mention Anderson Global's CEO making an unexpected helicopter exit from a family wedding. My PR team would field the inevitable inquiries about whether there was drama behind the departure. But tonight, for the first time in years, I felt completely free to be exactly who I was: successful, accomplished, and no longer willing to hide it to make other people comfortable with their assumptions. The funny thing was, I'd spent so much energy trying to be humble that I'd forgotten there was a difference between humility and invisibility. Maybe it was time to let the world, including my family, see what I'd actually built. After all, Anderson Global Logistics hadn't revolutionized supply chain management by staying quiet.